I'm going to be sharing my talk about developer commenting habits and looking at some of the conflicting attitudes that folks have when they talk about commenting and documentation. Now, I just want to let you know, questions are a-okay. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, our wonderful MC will kind of give me a nudge, and we'll get those answered for you. So I wanted to have us all think about, you know, and obviously we aren't doing a show of hands, but how many of us have kind of made a comment to themselves as they were coding, you know, did that nice little hashtag and said, you know, note to self, toot, 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 toot. Now, probably a bunch of us are thinking, oh yeah, I've done that. And there could be lots of reasons that we would choose to do this. There may have been a variable that we were scared to change. We could have just copy pasted a section of code from online and wanted to remind ourselves exactly what it did, because it's easy to forget what you didn't write. And you may have made a choice that you wanted to explain to your future selves, because it's really easy to forget why you wrote something the way you wrote it. But when you made that last comment, did you think that you were writing documentation? Now, documentation is what allows code to be used, expanded, adapted, and for community to be formed. So when you wrote that last comment into your code, you were probably making a note about something that was unclear. And we often don't think about comments this way, but they could be considered a form of documentation. So in documentation, as this image perfectly illustrates, can either cause or relieve programmer pain. Now, why do we use comments? We use them to show authorship, purpose, describe functions, clarify tricky code or unclear decisions. And so with all these different uses for comments, you might think we'd start using them everywhere. But what's the problem with that? Comments actually have a pretty bad reputation. And some of this is true. While testing, if we use it, can point us to possibly outdated function strings, there's nothing that I found to help with those keep those inline comments up to date. So our problem of too many comments can point to unclear code, code that you would want to refactor, that you would want to comment as you wrote and come back and refactor later. But there's something that we forget when we talk about what should trigger a period of refactoring. If your workplace values creating code over maintaining code, you won't be given time and support for maintenance. Unfortunately, the small companies that many of us have as our first programming jobs are likely to emphasize code creation as over code maintenance. You know, those of you who are probably nodding your heads along and thinking, you know, of all the times you've heard, oh, we don't have time for that, you know, can kind of attest to this. So if you're in a situation where your team supports code improvement as much as code creation, that's wonderful. But if you find that refactoring is pushed to the back burner again and again, you probably have to work yourself up to wrapping your head around what may have become very old code. So refactoring can start to feel like an act of self-care rather than part of your day. So when you go into that deep into that months or years old code, you might have to put yourself in the right mindset. You put yourself in a good mood, go to your favorite room of the house, play concentration music softly, and maybe, as this person did, get into a relaxing tub and light some candles before getting down to work. This comic takes on a little more nuance when we consider the idea of rotten or old comments, those comments that we always worry about. So if the message is no longer just docs are important to support your community, it can also take on the message having outdated docs misleads. And in fact, there have been real losses that could have been avoided by a well-placed inline comment. On my research, I was told about an incredible loss of data due to a dev changing a value unknowingly, and I wondered, is it possible a clarifying comment on this critical call could have saved the day? So if we remember the folks who use comments as a form of documentation, we see we're sending a confusing message. So I want to take you down the good, the bad, and the ugly of commenting. We're going to play a little game of call out those comments, and I want to show you some comments that early developer Veronica wrote, and we can decide whether or not they make sense. So here, I was making a memory flashcard game, and which started as a tutorial, and I said, okay, well, I want people to know that this isn't entirely my work. So I'm going to cite the tutorial that, kind of got me jump started on this at the top. And most people would say, oh yeah, sure, like everybody loves a good, a good doc string at the top explaining what's going to happening in that file. So we'd probably feel pretty good about this comment. So we'll probably agree that this is okay. But in our second, we have a much more complicated problem. My first time using Beautifulsoup, I wanted to scrape a website for my local climbing wall. Now, I worked at a lab on MIT's campus, and there was the student climbing wall just like 50 feet away from my office. And I hatched a plan. I said, well, when the students come like during lunch or on their off hours and open the wall for a short time, I'm going to be there, and I want to make sure that I always see when it's open. So I'm never disappointed to learn that, it had been open during lunch hour, but I'd missed it. So I decided to use a web scraper. And I said, okay, I'm going to use Beautifulsoup, and I want to check if this says open or closed. But I hadn't used Beautifulsoup before, and I had I made myself a bit of a mess. So you see here, I made comments that, acted as a bit of a to-do list. Hey, this is supposed to be, this is what this line is doing. I added comments that described what, that acted as an outline. But I also added comments that commented out pieces of non-working code, because I said, look, I might need this in the future. Maybe it almost works. Maybe whatever I write next will be more broken than this, and I'll want to go back. I wasn't using our good friend version control yet. And also I want to point you to my favorite comment to date. Oh, it's a list. Thank God. So if anyone's ever gotten to that point of frustration where they're just like, you can look at that and have a good chuckle. But I have to ask, these comments all made sense to me at the time, but you see, even reading, even like reviewing this with you now, I have some trouble remembering what I was thinking. And would you want to contribute to a code base that had, similar pileups of comments throughout? No, you would run as quickly as possible in the other direction. This is terrible. It shows you're going to have a terrible experience contributing. You have every right to run away from that. So I spent some time thinking I didn't want to be writing comments like that forever. So I spent some time thinking about best practices, and I found there was a lot of disagreement. So I made us a list. These are some best practices that we can usually agree on. Doc strings, they should have inputs, outputs, and they should explain what the function is doing. And we can agree that too much is too much, and that outdated comments are dirty, filthy lies. And then there's these ones on the right, which, there's a little more disagreement about. So, and the explanation for why we use comments differently makes a lot of sense. there's variation for different styles, and you know, companies will even have style guides explaining like, look, this is how we do this and how we do this. And I don't, and comments seem no different. And you know, so comments can be a really invaluable part of the code base, but there's all this nuance around them. So I started to ask some questions. I found that a lot of people said, you know, no comment means bad code. And so when do we know when like we're just labeling our cats and when our comments are really too much? The internet, of course, has some advice. It's super hard to find the right commenting style because of competing, because it's difficult for even experienced developers to sort out what should be done consistently. So, you know, on one hand, you don't want to repeat yourself, so you should be keeping things DRY dry. And on the other hand, code without documentation gets really unusable really quickly. And, you know, if we are using comments as a form of documentation, like where do those fall into our thinking there? And the one piece of advice, the piece of advice I will never forget, is, you know, I went out onto the internet and I said, how do I determine the best way to comment? You know, when should comments be happening? And I heard some advice over and over. I heard you should refactor, don't use comments, use only the right comments, only your code matters. And my favorite comment of all, thank you internet, was just code better. It doesn't really help if someone is not going to tell you what you should be doing instead. Has anybody here seen a good old Stack Overflow dry Smackdown? It's about what you would expect. Someone comes in and exposes their vulnerability only to hear that they are wrong, very wrong, just all the way wrong. And we're used to seeing it, but you know, let's be honest. Comments like "this has been discussed to death" are not really helpful, and it's hard when you're getting those comments to really hear anything but, you know, your struggle bores me and you're just a bad programmer. And I think it's really important for us to take a pause and remember how the newest programmers might experience comments. So newbies are trying to learn an overwhelming amount of information at once. Diane here says, I don't know what the heck I did last night. Something JavaScript. I just committed a lot of stuff. And I don't know about you, but I would like to look for ways to support Diane. Now, as I've started talking to programmers and you know, and mentoring less experienced programmers, I've seen folks use comments in a lot of different ways. Some use to label, some use to you know, mark their questions to ask later. Some use for outline. Yes, some start off using them as storage, and there are better solutions, but they'll get there. And it's important to think about what happens if we start to tell these folks who are using comments as an aid to help them learn. What happens if we tell them that only clean, comment-free code is okay? So I talked recently to a developer who is, you know, an artist that has started programming and making generative art, and they like putting together a lot of things very quickly, and they just want to get it to work. So they said, well, you know, I tend to write comments all over the place. I'll literally mark a comment, marking, I was here, as a way, like I stopped here, as a way of reminding them like what has been done, what hasn't, what still needs to be connected, so that when they walk off and have dinner and come back, they can kind of remember where they were. Now, obviously you don't want to see that staying in a code base for very long. But remembering the person's like use case and like what they're trying to accomplish and come back to is can be really really important. And so if we think about comments as like an aid that can help us keep track of our to-dos, help us in all these different ways, and consider different use cases, it's easy to see that that like for newer programmers, comments can really be they can be magic in a way, and they can really allow you to do a lot more than you had give yourself a little bit of a lifeline. So I had been thinking about how, newer programmers so often were using these comments, and but then when I talk to more experienced programmers, they usually say like, oh no, dry code or bust. That's really the only way. And I said, well, what happens in between? Like, how do we get from there to there? And like, should we be doing it that way? So I did what everybody does. I took to Twitter and did a Twitter poll, and unfortunately a Twitter poll was conducted. Now you'll see that since I'm very popular on Twitter, I got an entire 9 responses. Now the interesting thing is of these 9 responses, of course you can't do anything with 9 responses, but what interested me is the split was almost 50-50. And I said, wow, there's something to look at here. So I decided to start asking some more questions and got a lot more serious about my survey. So I started asking when folks added comments, what functions they used comments for, and I asked them some questions. Do they agree or disagree? And these are broadly, the first several are like broadly comment positive questions, and a few are more like comment negative questions. So let's see what some of our results are. So when I asked how they had recently used comments, I saw that of the, about 177 folks that responded, very few used it to store unused code, which, helps me breathe a sigh of relief a little bit. But a whole lot of people, little under half the respondents, said that they commented, they made brief comments when they weren't certain exactly what the code was doing and they were kind of thinking through it, and or commented out each function. And then I was really surprised to learn about 2/3 of the respondents said, yes, I write inline comments, even though the internet had been like, oh no, never inline, disgusting. So I kind of wondered about that a little bit. So then I had asked, like, at what point in your development process do folks add comments? And it looks like a lot of, most folks were adding them in points where they realized someone had misunderstood something that had been written. So at some point in review or possibly pairing. But most people used comments when they were experimenting, when they were saying like, will this work? How about we, so, this kind of, makes me wonder if that was kind of in a note-taking capacity that they were using those comments. And then there were, a lot fewer that used it like directly as they were learning. A lot of folks wanted to get things done. So then we look at the you know, agree, strong disagree being 1, and strong agree being yes. So in blue, I asked, do comments help me remember the code I had written, or what I was thinking, or like, you know, stand in as a bit of a memory aid. And so you know, slightly under 90 of our 177 response said, you know, like, yes, that is a strong agree. And so it's a pretty sharp drop off from there. The same with, do comments help me clarify my thinking? And even more strongly, do comments save developers time? That's something, as you can see, the green is like fairly, you know, it has a pretty narrow tail there. And then I asked the question that I had heard so often, the comment that I heard so often when I was cruising the internet trying to figure out how I should be commenting, was that there's no space for inline comments, and that comment, you know, the function level comments were fine, but inline comments were just off the table. And the respondents that I had, as you can see, pretty strongly were either 1s or 2s on the disagree and strongly disagree scale. So let's look at some more data. And then the last question I asked was, so one thing I had heard when I was getting started is that comments were fine as you were writing the code, but should be removed before the code, like, you know, is put up to GitHub, or like basically maybe used and seen by others. And the feedback I had gotten is like, oh, people won't take you seriously as a developer if you're showing that you're using these comments as aids, even if it's something that you know, revise or take out later during a refactor. Like, you know, you kind of don't want to show your hand here. So I made sure to ask the question, you know, just like that, like, are comments something that are fine as you're going, but should be removed before it goes up to GitHub? And I had a bit of a surprise. The responses really flattened out here. You remember how strongly folks were agreeing and disagreeing with the other points. Here, this yellow, there's really no strong anything across there. It's fairly flat, and so, you know, that kind of made me think, like, oh, so even amongst this group of people, and the respondents to this survey were, you know, fairly comment positive on a whole, you know, still kind of had this internalized idea in their mind, probably they're reading the same Stack Overflow comments that I am, that comments are really bad stuff. And even though they're helpful to us in all these ways, and we really wish, you know, we really do use them. Like, even within the same survey, folks were like, oh yeah, inline comments, I do those. We still think that they need to be like scrubbed before things are posted. And I think there's, you know, a lot of thought that could go into why it is that we think this way, and how we've gotten there. So as I was putting this data together and thinking about what all this meant, I saw this quote, and, you know, there's a lot of words up there, but the point kind of is, you know, our code, the things we create, they're not just software. It kind of shows us like where we are, and, like, you know, how we problem solve, and, you know, how we approach these things. And then if I had to put it on, you know, into fewer words, I would say, you know, our documentation and the way we do things, and like the comments that we put down, it's true that it points to code that needs to be refactored, because it tells us, you know, where we were when we were writing that segment of code. It shows us what causes us confusion, what needs to be documented, and yeah, of course, what needs to be refactored. So what can we do to support folks who are, you know, get it started programming and just want to comment every logic? And the things I came up with are, you know, they're not easy, like, you know, but the ideal case, I think, is if we're able to, you know, praise the accomplishments that folks are having, while like nudging them towards the future. So, you know, when you see those comments everywhere, like point out that it's a, you know, it's a method of problem solving, and like the person is using, you know, every tool they've got, but that, you know, in the future they're going to want to use version control, and they're going to want to, you know, revise so that, you know, you can talk to them about code rot and the fact that like those comments are something that they'll have to maintain. But it turns out that empathy can be really hard. So, you know, but if we can spend some time thinking about the overwhelmed learner that we met earlier today, and like, you know, kind of sharing in that perspective, a few things I thought of that I think we can do to normalize the way everybody codes, you know, with those comments in, and is sometimes, you know, maybe ashamed to do so, is to just like, if you write with comments, like if you're doing a presentation and your code snippet, like when you were writing it, has comments in it, go ahead and have those be there. And, you know, to folks who at any stage want to take a deep dive and read others' code, like seeing what habits other people have around not only their documentation and their code, but like the bits that overlap, I think could be very valuable. And I do think we should spend some time thinking about, you know, how we think about comments. You know, are they a form of docs? They could be. So with that, I really appreciate you coming. I'm happy to take questions, and feel free to get in touch with me at any point. And thank you very much. And I'll be posting these slides, and there are some learning resources as well at the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Veronica. Everybody, make sure to give Veronica a round of applause right there in the Slack channel. Feedback for our speakers is always fantastic. Veronica, this was the worst security talk I've ever heard.
Right?
Total
it was really bad.
Forehead move. I mean, the only place that had an update is the place I was looking. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Everything's okay. I'll be honest, everybody. There was no way I was going to be able to write a whole new talk in the last like month and a half. I'm glad you're all here, and that yes, and that everything's okay, and we're still talking about Python and stuff.
Right.
But,
yeah. So I posed that same poll that you had on Twitter here on Loudswarm, and a lot of no's, a lot of dries. 67%. So 2/3 are dry folks. I'm a comment. Well, I don't do development anymore, and the only development I actually have done is a lot of Android development. So I'm a little bit of a faker here at this conference. I am a comment every line. I'm like, what does this do? What does this do? I don't know what this is. That's great.
Let me go see Slack.
Yeah, let's go head over to the Slack. Let me go look in the audience QA here in Slido. See if I have any questions. I'm not seeing anything right now, but I know a few folks
have
been hanging.
In so much shock. They were like, I brought my security questions. Veronica, the renowned security expert, was going to tell us some things.
Right. Actually, I do have a question kind of like totally like off like subject of any comments, but I'm reading, like, you're reading your bio here, and it says like you helped pick the Mars Curiosity rover as a landing site. What's the story behind that?
Oh yeah. So I worked at JPL for it was like a total of a year split over basically like I did a long internship and then went back to school a little bit and then came back. But so my background's in geology. So the reason, one reason that I'm all like, hey, why do we do development the way we do is because I'm coming from somewhere else.
Sure.
So my background's in geology, and I was really interested in remote sensing and like chemistry and planetary surfaces at the time. So it was a really great combination of things. And we worked on a project to like quantify rock counts of the Martian surface so that if Curiosity landed, there wouldn't be like any like boulder sitting right under where it landed. Everybody joked that if that happened, I would never have a job at NASA. And lo and behold, I don't have a job at NASA anyway. So like,
Yeah, they were wrong. That's too fun. That's so cool. Glenn makes a good comment saying, good comments. Don't repeat the code. They explain the why. Too true.
I think one of my favorite comments so far is just space.
Space.
I agree.
Awesome. Well, if anybody has any other questions or anything like that for Veronica, she'll be over in the breakout room, and we'll make sure we can have some other cool conversations about space and whatnot as well. Veronica, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here, and I will talk to you later.
All right. Thank you so much.